Planning a scouting trip to Portugal takes some serious preparation. You're not just coming here on vacation, you're actually here to figure out three critical things. One, do I even want to live in Portugal? Two, where do I want to live? And three, can I find a property to rent or buy? Now, number three isn't necessarily for everyone. You don't necessarily need to rent or buy a property on your scouting trip, but it could be important if you're applying for a visa like the D7, as you need an address in Portugal before you make the application. Hi, I'm James. I'm the creator of Portugalist.com, and I'm the author of Moving to Portugal Made Simple. I've been running Portugalist since 2016, and since then, thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people have visited the website and used it to help them make the move to Portugal. And if coming up with a scouting trip sounds intimidating, don't worry. By the end of this video, you'll know how to create the perfect scouting trip that's absolutely right for you. Now, what's the biggest challenge in moving to Portugal? Portugal is a complicated country to move to, I'm not going to lie. Getting visa appointments is challenging. Knowing which paperwork is required at the particular consulate you're going to, that's a lot harder than you would think. But the biggest issue? Figuring out where you actually want to live. Now, I get a lot of emails from people that are quite vague. They say they want to live somewhere in Portugal. Sometimes they just say, I want to move to Portugal, but don't really specify where. But often they'll say, I want to live somewhere. It's got to be walkable. It should have a farmer's market. It should be safe, and it should be near the beach. But this is much too vague. Most places in Portugal have a municipal market. It's just still a part of the culture. Most places in Portugal are actually quite safe as well, especially when you compare them to the US. And if you take a look at a map of Portugal, you can see just how much of it is surrounded by coastline. But there's a big difference between living in, say, the Algarve, which is in the coast on the south, and living by the coast in northern Portugal. There's a big difference in climate, particularly in wintertime. There's a big difference in the cost of living. The south is more expensive, the north is cheaper. There's a big difference in culture, the amount of English spoken, and how authentic it is. So just saying I want to live by the coast in Portugal isn't enough. You really need to do a lot of preparation and figure out which region do I want to live in, what's my short list of towns. You don't have to know exactly, but you need to have a rough idea. Now, you're probably going to have a limited amount of time in Portugal, so we need a strategy. First of all, let's figure out how much time you can spend here. Now, for a lot of people, particularly those coming from the US, UK, Canada, etc., they'll be coming in on the Schengen visa, which typically allows them to spend 90 days in every 180 days. I think 90 days is a good rule for most people, even those coming from other EU countries. Of course, most people can't actually dedicate 90 days to exploring Portugal. Most people have about a week or two, so they'll need to be very selective about which locations they can visit. Now, I would say one of the best places to start is on Portugalist.com. There you'll find guides to all of the different locations around Portugal. Now, another thing that I like to look up is walking tour videos. So there are quite a few videos, particularly of locations, bigger locations like Lisbon or Porto, for example, where people have just walked around the entire city for hours with a camera on them. Now, just watching this for half an hour gives you a really good idea of what a location is like, and it often goes into streets that you wouldn't necessarily see on the more touristy videos. Now, we need to create an itinerary, and you may have a list of locations across the whole of Portugal, or you may just want to focus on a particular region. A lot of people want to move to the Algarve, for example, or Madeira, or the Silver Coast. But it's not unusual for somebody to be considering a list of locations all across Portugal. So maybe Braga in the north, Caldas da Rainha on the Silver Coast, Setúbal just below Lisbon, Cascais, close to Lisbon, and Tavira in the south. These are all extremely popular locations that everybody is talking about right now. Now, if you do have locations that are spread out across the country, you need to be a little bit smarter about how you plan this entire trip because you'll be limited on time and you need to do things in the best possible way. But thankfully, Portugal isn't a huge country and you can get between, say, Lisbon and Porto or Lisbon and Faro in around 3 hours each. Another thing to think about is flights. Now, chances are you'll be flying into Lisbon and flying out of Lisbon, particularly if you're coming internationally from somewhere like the US or Canada. It may be possible to fly into Porto. Sometimes they get larger international flights there. And there's a chance that you could fly into Faro. Usually that's an add-on flight at the end. But generally speaking, most people end up flying into Lisbon. Now, Lisbon is unfortunately right in the middle of the country. So it kind of makes these sort of top to bottom or bottom to top trips a little harder to plan because ideally what you want to do is start at one end and work your way down. But that isn't possible when you fly into Lisbon. You can do it that way if you want. You can fly into Lisbon, go up to the top, and then work your way back down. Or you can, do a couple that are closer to Lisbon to begin with, then go down to the south, then go up to the north. There's really no correct way to do it. One mistake I would avoid making is trying to visit too many places because visiting too many places it can leave you feeling quite burnt out and you don't really end up getting a good enough feel for each of them. The more time you can spend in each place, the better. Now, what you want to do in your research phase is whittle your big long list of potential locations down to more of a short list. Now, the way you can do this is one, watching videos of these places, reading more about it, going online, seeing what the pros and cons of each of those are. As mentioned, Portugalist is a great starting point for that. But also think about what you want. Do your homework on this. So come up with what are the most important things for you. For example, if you're a family, you probably need to live in a location that has good schools. Now, do they need to be international or private schools or public schools? That's up to you. But if it's international schools, for example, that's really going to narrow it down. If it's public schools, well, then you will still be narrowing it down because obviously you want one of the best possible choices for your kids nearby. Another thing to think about, particularly if you're more elderly, is do you need to have a really good hospital nearby? Does it need to be a private hospital or can it be a public hospital? Are you going to live car free, or at least are you thinking of living car free? And do you need to have great public transport nearby? These are the sort of things that you can actually research online in advance and use to narrow down your list. Another thing that I would do is take a look at Idealista, which is the main property portal in Portugal, and you can get the cost of renting there and the cost of buying there just by looking through what's available. So if you're looking at, for example, Cascais, which is one of the more expensive locations in Portugal, and you realize, hey, actually, this is quite expensive. I'm not sure if this is within budget. That's great because now you can cross it off the list. Now, if you're thinking about buying a property in Portugal, find out how much you can actually afford. Speak to a mortgage broker. They will do a calculation for you based on your income or based on the income that you think you'll have when you're ready to buy and tell you what you can afford. This is really good to know because, for example, going back to Cascais, there isn't a huge amount of point in moving there with the intention of staying if you're going to find out a year later that actually you're not able to get a big enough mortgage to continue living there. Even if you're buying in cash, take a look at the property prices, or at least the prices that are coming up on Idealista, just to get an idea of what's within budget. Now, a lot of people ask me, what should I do when I'm in a place? How can I make the most use of my time when I've got boots on the ground in Portugal? I would say, aside from figuring out where you want to live, which is the number one biggest thing, the next biggest thing is to look at property. Now, if you're applying for a visa, like the D7, for example, you need an address in Portugal for your application. You don't need this for the Golden Visa, for example, but you do need this for the D7. Now, for a lot of people, this means that they end up renting, typically for a year, because that's what most consulates require. And no, it can't be an Airbnb or a hotel in most cases. So you need a rental. And this is the perfect time to find one. You don't actually have to find the rental on this search. It would be very helpful if you did, though, because a rental, especially somewhere that you might live in a year, is really something that's better experienced in person. Now, you can do all of this remotely. You can hire an agent who will go to different places and scout them out for you. Many of them will do video calls to show you around, but it isn't quite the same as seeing it in person. Now, if you're planning to buy, it's even more important that you see that in person because that is even a bigger commitment than planning to rent for somewhere for a year. Speak to a mortgage broker in advance, as mentioned, so that you know how much you have to play with if you need to take out a loan. Similarly, I would say it could be worth working with a buyer's agent, especially since a lot of them don't charge. They get a commission from the seller's agent and are able to work with people like that. Now, why a buyer's agent rather than just going up to the realtor's window and checking what's available and saying, hey, show me that? You can absolutely do that, of course, and that's probably what most people do. But an estate agent is more likely to show you their properties only, and they will leave it up to you to figure out whether this is a good buy or not. And if you bought property before, you will have a very good idea. At least you will have a very good idea of what you want. But a buyer's agent is slightly different. They're the agent that work on your behalf to make sure it's right for you. Unlike the seller's agent, they're there to sell the property to you, not to tell you what's wrong with it. And so a buyer's agent will actually tell you what's wrong with it. They'll look at whether things are likely to all be legal there. Not always the case. They'll point out if there's potential mold issues there. Very easy to miss those, especially during summer months. And they'll basically spot issues that you wouldn't even know to look for because you haven't lived in Portugal yet, so you don't know what the property market is like here. Now, if you have more questions about that, please get in touch with Portugalist or visit the Portugalist website where you'll find more articles on buyer's agents and what they do. Now, another thing I recommend looking at while you're here is schools. So if you have kids, schools are going to dictate where you live. Unless you're homeschooling, of course, but generally speaking, most people end up putting their kids into school. And you can use the ranking tables to get a good idea of what's possible. You can read reviews, but it is another thing where it is much better to get a feel for it in person than it is just to sort of figure it out on paper. So, should you try and open a bank account while you're here? Obviously, a lot of people want to do this. They want more choice of banks. And a lot of people think it's simply a case of going into a bank and saying, hey, I want to open an account with you. But there are money laundering laws, there are regulations, and these have got a lot stricter in recent years, especially more recently. And it's made it very difficult for people coming from outside of the EU to open bank accounts in Portugal before they are resident. Now, you can go from bank to bank and branch to branch and try to find one that will open an account for you. And I think for most people, with a few country exceptions, but for most people, they will eventually find something. But you could spend a long time doing it. You could potentially spend days. Even opening an account can actually take several hours of your precious time. And it is precious time because you are only here for a limited amount of time and there are better things that you could do. A bank account is actually something that you can figure out on paper, unlike schools for your children or unlike an apartment to rent or buy. Now, the NIF number, which you need for opening the bank account and everything else, that's your Portuguese tax number. In theory, you can actually come and get it in person. Often you will need a fiscal representative, someone living in Portugal who can act as that. If you don't have it, that typically means getting a lawyer or someone like that. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, at least financial sense, to go do all of this, to stand in finances, to try and get an appointment there if that's needed, when you can do it online and you can pay a company to do it for you. Most charge anywhere from around 70 euros, maybe just slightly less, up to around 300 euros, depending on the company, and they will deliver that to you within a couple of days. Now, for my favorite bit, when I go to a new country, go to the supermarkets and see what's available. This is always interesting to me to see what's available, what's not, what products are there that I haven't tried before. But also think about what's not there. So, for 99% of supermarkets, you will not find ranch dressing. So, if you're coming from America and that is something that you like, keep that in mind. Basically, there are some things that you will not be able to find, and you need to sort of ask yourself, are these things that I'm going to miss? Am I surprised that they're not there? Am I surprised that the selection, for example, might be a lot smaller than I'm used to? Am I going to have to find alternatives? Am I going to need to learn to make these things for myself, like ranch dressing, for example? I do think it's a good idea to cook for yourself while you're there, so you're not just going to the supermarket aimlessly. If you go in there with a shopping list, with a bit of a mission, it will make it easier. It will give you an idea of what it's like to cook in a Portuguese apartment. Now, if you're staying in an Airbnb, you'll probably be limited on sort of whether they give you enough frying pans or pots and things like that. But it does give you an example of what it would be like to shop in a Portuguese supermarket, what it would be like to put it in a European size fridge, and what kind of food you could make with all of that. Keep a detailed track of all your spending throughout all of this, your restaurant meals, your grocery shopping, your Uber trips, things like that. And then when you get home, you can kind of compare, hey, how much did filling up the car in Portugal cost versus back in the UK or the US? How much was that Uber ride, etc.? It won't give you a full picture of the cost of living in Portugal because there are other costs, like say property taxes, which you won't come across when you're just visiting, but it does start to give you an idea of the basic cost of things. Now, having boots on the ground in Portugal does give you an opportunity to meet people. So, one group of people you may want to meet would be the people handling your relocation. So, if you're using a lawyer, for example, and typically that's a very good idea to do that, or if you're using an accountant or a tax advisor, something like that, you don't have to meet them in person. You don't have to come all the way to Portugal to meet them. Anyone working in relocation should work online these days, should be able to do Zoom meetings, but a lot of people do like to come to Portugal and to meet them in person, so this can be very, very valuable. Now, it can be very useful to go to a meetup and meet people who are actually living here. So, one way to do this is just to post on Facebook or in a forum and ask if anybody living here is interested in getting a coffee. Some people will say yes. But if you get the opportunity to go along to an actual meetup, you'll be able to talk to a lot of different people potentially and get a lot of different opinions. And that can be very, very helpful. I would say that it is useful going to the groups that are most relevant to you. So, if you're a parent, for example, finding parenting information or finding information about schools and things like that in Portugal, that can be quite hard. But going along to a meetup with other expat parents, that will help you get the information that you need. Basically, take the time to find your people. Now, if you don't fall into any particular category, it might just be the people in the place that you're considering living. Now, I would actually recommend speaking Portuguese on your scouting trip. And I don't just mean saying hola or obrigado. Basically, try and speak as much as you can because the scouting trip is a simulation for real life. You want to get an idea of what it would be like. And if you get over there and realize, hey, actually, I need to do a lot more work on my Portuguese learning, that's really, really useful feedback because then by the time you get here, you will have really improved. Another mistake people often make is they'll have been using Duolingo, which teaches Brazilian Portuguese, not European Portuguese, and very quickly will find that actually people end up correcting me and say I'm speaking the wrong type of Portuguese, at least for living in Portugal, and it would have been much, much easier if I had learnt the European variation on Portuguese. I also want to recommend staying in apartments and houses if you can, rather than hotels. Sometimes this isn't the practical option. Sometimes it makes more sense to say, stay in a hotel because it's right next to the train station and you're short on time. But ideally, what you want to do is you want to stay in a Portuguese property because that's probably what you're going to end up living in. And if you're coming, say, from the US or even from Northern Europe, the buildings are quite different. The style is quite different. They're smaller. There may be issues with noise coming through, things like that, and you want an experience. You want a chance to actually know what this is like, and you won't necessarily get that if you're staying in a hotel. I would also say if you can, try and stay in more residential areas. Again, this might not make practical sense, but if you can live in a residential area, somewhere that just has, the basics like a supermarket, a couple of cafes, etc. It isn't, downtown tourist land. This will give you much more of a feel for what living there would actually be like. You'll need to think about how you're going to get around while you're here, which means either public transport or driving. This is a good opportunity to experience either or potentially both. You will cover a lot more ground in a car, okay? So especially if you're visiting small towns, it's much easier to get from one to the other. You won't be limited by timetables as much, and actually getting from but town to town by bus or train can be a little challenging to work out. You'll also get to experience driving in Portugal, which I think is important. It's not as bad as people say, but there are definitely some things to learn about. And you'll get to see what a typical European sized car is actually like and how challenging it is to park in some locations. If you're thinking about living without a car in Portugal, and a lot of people do think about this before they move here and often change their mind later on, give it a proper test now. So try the local buses, especially. So a lot of people, when they come to Portugal, they end up taking the train. So you can take the train from, say, Lisbon to Porto, or from Lisbon to, Faro in the Algarve, somewhere like that. That's easy. The train services are quite good. There's good amount of timetables, and it's easy to get from one to the other. Where public transport isn't so good in Portugal is within the connections between small towns, local bus connections. In fact, even just getting the timetables or figuring out where each town connects, and that's really challenging. There isn't a good amount of information online most of the time. Often won't even find the bus timetables in the bus stop. You need to go to the bus station if there is one, or the tourist information center to get them. So it's a good idea to actually experience this and say, hey, could I actually live without a car here? Check if there's Uber, check if there's Bolt. You don't necessarily need to take one, but it's a good idea if you do. If you're in a small location, you have plenty of options in somewhere like Lisbon or Porto, of course, but check what's available nearby, and whether people come and pick you up, and how long it takes for them to get there. If you are planning on using your phone a lot here, make sure that your provider offers roaming in Portugal and doesn't charge you a fortune for this. If they do, and now a lot of people in the EU will be able to come here and not have to think about roaming, but people coming from outside of that, particularly from the US, do need to think about it. It may be worth picking up a local SIM card, either from one of the shops or even from one of the stalls at the airport. The main providers often have stalls there, just so that you can get charged local rates and not come home to a big massive telephone bill. Now, will you be able to do all of this in one scouting trip? I don't know. Some people do. Some people just take one, and some people even find the property or maybe even buy a property all in one scouting trip. Other people, it takes them multiple times. They need to come back. They need to really decide if it's right for them. Then they maybe do more of an area focus on their next one in a different area the next time, and that's okay. You don't need to figure it all out in one go. In fact, you can potentially take, 2 long trips. The Schengen visa allows 90 days and 180 days. So it does allow you to spend quite a bit of time exploring in Portugal, as long as you keep within the limits. Now, if you can manage it, if you're taking more than one trip, I would say it's a good opportunity to come during both the summer and during the winter. Take somewhere like Porto, for example. Now, in summertime, Porto is quite warm. It's not as hot as Lisbon or the Algarve or anywhere like that, but it can get quite warm. It does get heat waves up there. And it's very busy with tourists. But come in winter and it's grey, it's damp, and it's a completely different story. So I think it's a good idea to see the two sides to it. The same with the Algarve, for example. And the Algarve is even hotter in summer, can be very, very hot in summer, but winter is actually quite a pleasant time. But houses in Portugal are quite cold. A lot of them don't have insulation. A lot of them don't have heating. So you may think, oh, it'll be fine in the Algarve because it's, 18 degrees Celsius out. In reality, it could be quite cold inside the house. It's a good idea to get a feel for that on a scouting trip and to figure out, one, would you like to live in Portugal? And two, if you did live here, what are you going to do about heating and staying warm if that's going to be, something that you need to think about? Look, I hope this video has been useful. At Portugalist, I try to make really, really comprehensive videos that actually give you practical information that you can use. As little fluff as possible. But you may still have questions, and that is understandable. After all, you're not going on vacation, you're potentially uprooting your entire life and moving somewhere completely different. If you have more questions, drop them below. Feel free to get in touch with me. I am more than happy to help, and as mentioned, I've helped thousands of people through Portugalist.com, and I'd be very happy to help you as well. Bye for now.